Check the mic and make sure it sounds right.
So welcome everyone to the group chat brought to you by Overmark. It's me, Darrell, with Xin Wei today, and we want to talk to you about identity crisis. Xin Wei, was there ever a time in your life where you felt like you had an identity crisis?
Well, I think always. I'm having a quarter life crisis right now. Do you have a quarter life crisis right now?
I'm past my quarter life already. I'm older than quarter life.
Okay, having a quarter life crisis right now. I think it's normal because it is just like we are always shaping our identity. We are always like relying on certain, be it external or internal things to tell us that, oh, this is who we are. I think today's topic is like quite vague, so we can like discuss in general. But like, for example, when we are younger, like going into like teenage year, we are shaping that. Like that is the prime age of shaping the identity. But then I think along the way, there will be many things that break your idea of identity, and then attempt to change it. And then you will be like, oh my God. Then you have a crisis, which is like me right now, my quarter life crisis. And then then you will continue gathering things to reshape it. And then maybe at some point it get broken down again, and then you have to reshape it again, and it get broken again. Yeah.
It's definitely evolving, that's for sure.
Yes.
I think today, right, I don't want to approach it from like I giving advice kind of thing, but I just genuinely want to share my own journey. So not that I'm much older than our listeners, hopefully not that much, but a little bit more. But I just wanted to share like maybe different phases in my life, how my identity has evolved. And I do acknowledge that identity is important, but I want to touch on the more detailed level of what I mean by identity. Then I think we can go on to help you guys understand how this process works. And then hopefully if you ever meet an identity crisis, you're able to deal with it with a bit more perspective. Because this kind of perspective, you can't get it until you've been through it. So whatever thing we just shared, right? Maybe there are certain phases that you've already been through. But if you haven't been to like the further phases, just because we are older, right? Maybe in the future when you meet it, you're more better equipped. Now, I'll start off since I'm already like sharing. One of the first identity that I built for myself was that of an athlete, right? So naturally, when I grew up, I found that, okay, I like sports. I was quite good at it. So I built a lot of my identity based on that. So in primary school, I was like the top athlete in my school. I was like, wow, I'm so good at sports, right? I literally won like the Sports Boy Award when I graduated from primary school. Literally, like I was the best. But my first crisis came when I went to secondary school. Because primary school is a very small cohort, right? So the people you're competing with is like within a circle, it's like, I'm great, I'm like, I've run very fast, whatever nonsense. But the first time I went to secondary school and it was a boys' school and it was a big cohort, like there were so many people that were good at sports too. And then the sports that I was good at, which was then running and swimming, it was like there wasn't a swimming CCA in my school. Then that was like my first crisis because like shit, like does it mean like I'm no longer good at sports? Like what am I gonna cling my identity onto? That was my first identity crisis. And I realized that, at that point in time, it was very difficult to deal with those emotions. I was like, oh, should I just like continue pursuing swimming, or like I should go and join track and field even though I hate just running because it's boring? Then eventually I hit a point where like, screw that, like who am I trying to prove to, right? Then in the end, I just decided to join a new sport that I really enjoyed. So in Sec 1, I decided to join floorball. And it wasn't a very identity building kind of thing, because the other CCAs in our schools were all like really good. They were like constantly top 4, nationals, those kind of stuff. But our CCA just started. So we were like constantly losing. We don't have like proper facilities. We have no seniors at all because I was literally the first batch of players. So it wasn't a very identity building thing to be part of that CCA. So being a floorball player wasn't my identity. But what really changed, right, was the fact that we weren't good. And it was a process of training really hard together, and training hard outside, and training hard by myself. And of course, we had like that Cinderella story, because eventually when I was in Sec 4, our final year in DDIF, we actually won national champs. So that was like, wow, it's like quite a story, right? Then we were like, okay, that's like great. But I think the identity building wasn't the fact that we won. I mean, that was awesome, of course, not going to deny that. But it was the process of working up to that point. That was my true identity building. Because what I built wasn't clinging on to like a fact. It wasn't like I'm a floorball player, but it's more of like the grit, the determination, the discipline, and the whole idea of like, how do we train to become that player? You know, that whole idea of self-excellence, like the practice, the hours that I poured in. That was my first real step about building an identity about myself. I realized that I was persistent, I was dedicated, I had the grit and I had the hunger to succeed. That was my identity, rather than the fact that I was a floorball player. So that's the first part of my story, Act 1. Okay, so I'm done with my Act 1, my first identity crisis. Maybe Xin Wei, I'll throw it to you first. All right, you can share your own journey. I think our listeners will be keen to find out yours too.
I think I never ever tied my identity to something very physical, because I think it has to do with a bit of my experience. I'm Malaysian, then I moved to Singapore. And when I was in Singapore, and just secondary school, right? 4 years of secondary school, I had 3 secondary school. So I spent Sec 1 in Malaysia, Sec 2 in Sec 2 in a Singapore neighborhood school, and then Sec 3 and Sec 4 in TKGS. So, and then after that, then I went to JC. JC is only 2 years, and I went to uni. So because of this changing environment, I never can have a very physical, tangible identity, because like what Darrell said, I think when you are like in that age, it's very easy to tie yourself to that. Like if you are an athlete, yes, your identity is an athlete. If you are you are in band, then your identity is music, that kind of idea. I think it's very easy because those are the most tangible and straightforward things to use. But unfortunately, I couldn't quite do that when I was in secondary school, because I changed secondary school so often. Like 3 secondary school in 4 years is just like almost like changing like one every year, right? Yeah, so I think that was my challenge, like finding what exactly that is. And so because of that, I think I tied it to something more non-tangible. Not really non-tangible, but I guess something that is not a physical thing. So for I think I always pride myself to be a very I always pride myself to be a very successful student in terms of studying, and but I'm not the mugger kind. Like I have to be like the also in class, like those quiet study students who study. I don't want to be those kind. I want to be very good in exam, but also do very well in terms of like influencing students, influencing my own classmates. Yeah, like a leader, like a very friendly person and friend with everyone, that kind of person. Yeah, and I think that was my identity, because even when I've changed school, I am capable of achieving that, that kind of thing. Yeah, so that became kind of like my identity. And I remember it was quite funny, because I remember going to TK and I was like, okay, this is my first exam, I need to do well, at the same time also do well in like social aspect. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, it wasn't like but you realize that those kind of things are not sustainable. They are not exactly an identity. I think Darrell brought up a very good point. His identity eventually was like perseverance, working very hard. Those are identity that are more sustainable, and I think it truly defines someone. It follows that person all the way.
Oh my god, then I really need to tell you about my Act 2. My Act 2 is like, wow, like some story script. Okay, I tell you.
Okay.
True story. This is my real own story.
Okay, so let's go. Act 2, let's go.
I stopped at the Sec 4, right? National champs and stuff. Then I was like, wow, they're doing damn good. So into JC, right? I DSA into my JC. I became the captain. I was in the youth team. I got like sports scholarship. Wow, it was just like up. So it further layered upon to that. I'm a winner, like achievements. And I went up. Then, right, it came the huge crash. Because after A-levels, I entered the army, right? So army suddenly, right, I was stripped completely of my identity, because in the army, I'm no longer like that, or the MVP floorball player and like, oh wow, so good, like achievements and stuff, suddenly all of that didn't matter. I was just, as they call it, a child recruit, you know? It's like, that is when my whole ego that I was building my identity to came completely crashing down. That was my real identity crisis. Because during that time, I didn't have like the time because I was always in army with a lot of trainings. I couldn't play floorball. So that aspect of me was completely stripped off. And there was like no achievements like that I could pride myself on anymore. So suddenly that whole structure that I've constructed of my identity came crashing down. And what was left was very fundamental things that I could still hold on to. The fact that I was hardworking, the fact that I was gritty. So it was that put me through army. And I think this idea of like your whole identity crashing, if you build it upon your achievement, that is really very dangerous. Because what if one day that achievement is stripped from you? Or maybe suddenly you are put in an external setting like I am. Suddenly you're put in the military where you had zero achievements, right? You're nothing. So how would you then look at yourself? When you look into the mirror, are you still that confident, that, you know, overflowing with energy individual, or are you an empty shell of yourself without those titles, you know? So that was my first humbling experience, that those titles that I had were nothing. They were merely titles that I was just making myself feel better about. But at the end of the day, when I strip it all away and I was scaled back down to just being myself, I realized how incomplete I was as a human, because my identity was constructed on a false premise. So that was my act two, where in the army, I was completely rid of that whole idea of my own identity. Xin Wei, do you had a, was it like that for you? I mean, you didn't go through the army, but was there like a identity crisis when you entered uni?
Crisis. Not really, but I had something similar in the sense that I think I tagged my, it's not really an identity, I guess, but a label to myself very proudly. But I feel like identity needs to be something that's independent, because I think your identity will flourish if it's independent. But if it's tagged to something, and when, like what Darrell say, when that thing is removed from you, you suddenly feel like you are super down. Like you are not that person that you are proud of anymore, which I feel like it shouldn't be like that. So one example, it's not a really like super big example like yours, but during uni or after A-level, I traveled a lot. So I always feel like, oh, I'm getting value from the world because I'm traveling so much. I'm seeing so many new things. Like I'm learning so many things. I am really living my life from traveling. And then everyone knows what happened, right? Fucking COVID happens and cannot travel anymore. And suddenly I'm like, oh, so I'm no longer learning things. I'm no longer that adventurous person that I know myself to be. I'm no longer that like stepping out of your comfort zone, go and meet new things, new people, try new things kind of person. Like I felt like I was no longer that person. But actually, to be fair, you don't need to travel to be an adventurous, try new things, step out of your comfort zone kind of person. You really don't need to. Stepping out of your comfort zone is not a physical thing. It could be a like action kind of thing, right? You don't need to physically step out of Singapore to consider yourself stepping out of comfort zone. And I think that took me a while to. How long did you take to realize about the army thing? How long do you take?
I think maybe 6 months in, I was I mean, I don't know whether I could quantify it as being depressed, but I think at least mildly depressed. Like I think that was very true. I don't want to like sugarcoat it. It was like low-key depressing. Yeah.
It also took me a while, like around that period. Like, you know, it now thinking back, it's something that's like very easy to like immediately conclude to that. But I feel like when you are in there, it took me so long to be like, there are so many things that you can do. You can try new hobbies in Singapore. And then, but I didn't do that. I was just like, oh my God, I can't travel. And now I'm a super boring person. Yeah.
Are you ready for my act 3 now?
Yes, of course. Come,
all
bring it
right,
on.
the story continues, the final trilogy. All right, so act 2. So I came out of our army with nothing to myself, and I was just looking to rebuild my identity. So after army, as any boring Singaporean boy would, all right, I proceeded on to uni. So that was my start of my redemption arc, I guess. So in uni, I really ramped everything up. I wanted to do everything. So I went back into floorball. So I started training. Then I delved into my passion, which was filmmaking. So I was like really on the ball over the years, like just going. It worked out really well. Like I became a lot better with my filming side. And I was also achieving a lot on the floorball front. So I was in the university team. I eventually made it into the national team for competition. And then I went on exchange. Then I did a lot more vlogging. Then I did like videography and a film for my final year project. So everything was progressing well. And suddenly uni finished, right? And COVID hit. That was a U-turn point as well. Number one, because I was like at the ending chapter of my floorball journey, right? Because after I like played for so many years, for 10 years or so, that was one of my fundamental identity I held close to myself. But when COVID hit, no sports, right? Until now, we are barely restarting. So suddenly, my identity as a athlete, as a floorball player, it was completely gone. But this time around, I was a bit more prepared because I was like, hey, I've been through this before. Sounds familiar in Act 2. So I wasn't as afraid. Instead, I looked at it as I'm closing a chapter in my life. But the real identity crisis came for me in terms of my future career. Because after uni, during uni, I did like 3 internships because I was like, oh, I need to be a go-getter, right? And it's like, you need to have the work experience. Then I did a lot of projects and stuff. They were all related to media. They were all related to filming and stuff. But when I graduated, I realized I didn't want to do it anymore. So it's like you spend 4 years working on this. And when you're right about to step into the workforce, I decided that, hey, maybe the film industry is not for me for various reasons. I just decided I wasn't going to do it. So that was a real period of crisis that coincided with me stepping down from floorball and looking forward into my career, what I wanted to be. And I was completely lost. But I think something that I took away from that was that I always found myself in university to be a person of action. I take initiative. I like to do things. I'm a go-getter. I'm not just somebody that say and I won't do, right? And whatever I wanted, I will pursue it. So focusing on those layers of qualities rather than actual achievements like, oh, my film won an award, so I'm a film guy. No, I never really tied myself to that. So when I eventually went into the workforce and stuff happened, like work and stuff. But eventually, I think one of the major projects, as to why you're even listening into this, was that I started Overmarked, right? So it was never in my identity that I would be like here doing a podcast, but it was more of my identity of like, I like initiative. I like to start new projects. I like to do things, that stuck with me. And that was what led me to doing Overmark. Of course, before this, I tried many different projects in university, of which all of them failed, right? A lot of different projects. But it was those learning experience that built my identity to be somebody that, oh, I'm not afraid to make mistakes, right? I just want to try and see what works. And I think that was like the beautiful part about it, that now I no longer identify myself as a floorball player, even though that has been the go-to thing for the past 10 years. I also neither identify myself as a film enthusiast. Now I'm just like a part-time vlogger if I travel, that kind of thing. But I realized that at the end of the day, all of these titles, they don't really matter anymore, right? Because at its core, I am very comfortable with who I am. I know who I am, and I understand what are some values that I hold close to my heart. So that is my identity now. I want to be somebody that, is unafraid of challenges, somebody that has determination to make things happen, and also a new layer to myself as I became a tutor to be somebody that is able to guide and provide value to others, which is why I think me and Xin Wei, we're always excited to do the podcast because we hope that by sharing our perspective, you learn something new. So that was my Act 3. I don't know whether there'll be an Act 4 and Act 5, but YOLO.
I enjoy your story, Darrell. I think this Act 1, 2, 3 is amazing story arc. And I think I think the learning point is amazing. I feel like you realize that I never really like say like what exactly my identity is because I don't know. I still don't know. I think recently, not recently, like maybe past 2 years, like ever since like we graduated, I realized that maybe my identity is just always working towards an ideal life that I want. And that can always change, but I'm always working towards that. And I think that concludes like maybe your past few years experience as well. Working hard towards what you want, and that can change, and that is fine. But we never stop working hard towards there, and that probably is like the identity that I can describe the best right now.
I think if there's one point we hope our listeners can take across this is that your identity is a constantly evolving process. You're constantly searching to understand yourself on a deeper level. I think in a way we're trying to say is it's pointless to try to tie your identity to achievements or to titles. Like you are like the president of the student council and that is your identity. I think that is a very dangerous thing because one day you're going to step down, then who are you, right? You're nothing? No, cannot be, right? So I think what's more important is to look inwards to pick out values that you can use to define yourself. Maybe you can start thinking what are 3 adjectives you'll use to describe yourself. That would be more of your identity builder rather than your titles of your achievements. So you realize yourself to be a what person. You know, I think draw on that. Like Xin Wei said, her identity is that she's motivated person, right? She's always working towards her desired goals. So I think the whole idea of building that identity is a lot more sustaining rather than very specific events. And I think if that helps you clear a bit of the cloud in your head, and if you're still in a state of searching for your identity, it takes time. And trust me, nobody is really certain of who they are fully, right? Even if the person says so, inside deep down is never the case because we are constantly evolving. I think that's the beautiful thing about growth, right? That we all seek personal growth in different ways. But you know, you have periods whereby you feel lost, and trust us, is normal. And there'll be periods where you feel you're invincible, but trust me, you're not, right? So at the end of the day, don't take yourself too seriously, okay? You don't really know who you are, and you're going to be constantly changing. So I think that's the mysterious part about it too. And I think that's pretty much it for today's podcast, right? Right, identity crisis. Definitely I've been through plenty, and I think there'll be plenty more to come. But that's the beauty of life. If you enjoyed our podcast, remember to give us a like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And with that, we'll see you in the next podcast. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
It sound right, boy.